Yeah, whatever.
All right, so good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming, regardless or despite of all the confusion about the rooms. So I hope that everybody who wanted to hear something about global governance and the problem of the second best is in this room. And it's my great pleasure to have two speakers who will deliver this lecture, and they are Karen Alter, who I think most of you will know because she's permanent visiting professor with ICORS and professor of political science and law at Northwestern, together with her colleague, Cristina Lafont, who is professor of philosophy at the same university, and they both direct the research group on global capitalism. So it's most fitting to have the two of them talk to us about global governance and the problem of the second best. The idea is that you talk for about 45, 50 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So the floor is yours.
I was just going to add a secondary introduction because I'm so thrilled to have Cristina come and see this other part of my world, design course. But this is because Cristina and I at Northwestern have founded a group on global capitalism and law. And so this is nothing like anything that I ever do in ICORS or have ever done before because it's philosophy. So she's going to present the first half and I'll present the second half. Cristina.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. I have never been here and I have heard about this group. I know through Andreas Folles, I think, about ICORS, and also now through Karen. So it's my pleasure to be here. Okay, so this is a complicated paper because it's written by a political scientist and a philosopher, and such that we have never worked in the other discipline ever together, so that's a first try. And the paper is interested in the issue of the problem of the second best when it comes to proposals for global governance reform. That's kind of like what we share. And there's a lot of interest and literature from very different disciplines about how we should improve global governance. But we couldn't find almost anything in that context of global governance reform that in any way touch on the problem of the second best. And so for us, it was like we thought we will find something, but we didn't. So we are starting like from scratch, it feels. And so what we are going to try to do here is to kind of motivate why we think that, first of all, anyone who is interested in proposals for global governance reforms should care about the problem of the second best and come up with some kind of solution to it. So that's our kind of like overall claim. And then, of course, we are trying to give some kind of examples of how we think what should go about thinking of that. The reason why anyone should care about second best reform is because the problem of the second best arises always under non-ideal circumstances. And I think chances are that for global governance reform, we will always be under non-ideal circumstances. So we really need to pay attention to the problem. Then we are going to try to kind of like make some kind of headway on criteria, ways to avoid the problem of the second best, and then also how one comes about making proposals that try to avoid the problem of the second best. And to show not only the kind of like abstract or more or less generic kind of proposals that we make, to show what difference does it make when it comes to specific proposals, we are going to show, illustrate the argument with the example of the WTO. How should one think about what reforms of the WTO will be better or worse? Right? Because there is independent interest in reforming the WTO. There's a lot of literature. But for us, mostly to see what difference does it make whether you have a second best strategy or what we call, and we think is the wrong strategy in general, what we call an approximation strategy. And that way, one can see what difference does it make. And that is, to us, more important than whether, particularly about the WTO, people will agree or not. So from the more abstract to the more concrete, we are going to have different types of claims, and not all of them have to turn out right, but we hope at least at the abstract level some may be convincing to some of you. Okay, so what is the problem of the second best? The problem of the second best has been worked out a lot, also even in political philosophy too, in general terms. So it's a generalization of Lipsy and Lancaster's theory of the second best. By now, the problem of the second best has been so generalized that it became clear that has nothing to do with the origins, that you get the problem of the second best pretty much whenever you are thinking of long-term actions under non-ideal circumstances. So it doesn't actually matter where you start, whether it's in economics, or, the problem can be generalized to even simple examples of action. So the problem basically is how do you determine what will be the second best strategy when, for whatever reasons, the first best strategy is unavailable. And unavailable doesn't mean really unfeasible. It means that you know it's not going to happen for whatever reasons. It could be that it could easily happen, but it's just not going to happen. So it doesn't have to be necessarily unfeasible, but in fact it's not going to happen. So if that is not going to happen, then how do you know what is the next best, the second best strategy, right? And what the problem of the second best shows is that assuming that when all the elements of the first best strategy are not available, the more of those elements that are available you realize gets you closer to the goal, right, is wrong. The idea is that the first best strategy does not give you really any information about what the second best strategy may be. And the reason is, of course, because the lack of elements that are not available may create circumstances where trying to approximate only those that are available may be counterproductive, may make things worse. And if that is the case, then what you may need is what we are going to call later countervailing deviations. You may need things that, although are not ideal, kind of like protect your proposals or what you are going to be changing from the bad effects that the lack of the other elements may produce under non-ideal circumstances. And so, the example we use in the paper is disarmament, right? Imagine that global peace requires disarmament. So the first best strategy will be general disarmament. But imagine you cannot get there. Imagine, or just look at around. So the idea that partial disarmament, like disarming one country at a time, will get you closer to total disarmament, may be absolutely mistaken. Like unilateral disarmament in a context of aggressive conflict, for example, could be a total disaster. It could actually precipitate war or whatever. Okay, so then the problem that arises for us, if you don't have a map of reform, like if identifying the ideal is not just doing anything about what to do to get there, right? And if you may need some kind of countervailing elements, you may need to actually go for non-ideal elements to counteract the bad situation. How do we know how to choose those elements? Like that was what we were initially looking for help in the literature, and we didn't find any in the context of global governance, right? How do we know which reforms proposals will be better under those non-ideal circumstances? And basically also what will be the criteria to know whether in general you will be making progress in some sense, or at least not making things worse, regardless of the particulars of all the types of different proposals. So that's a hard question. So let me start with the second question first, because I think it helps. The first question is the exact example that we are going to work through, but the criteria for reform, I think, is in general what needs to be answered for any proposal, right? That doesn't matter, so to say, what kind of proposal you are making or which set of institutions you are thinking of. So regarding the criteria that we have identified, one caveat that is important is that we are trying to be ecumenical. We are trying to draw from principles that we find in existing international law that have kind of wide support, and that in some cases they have been ratified by a lot of countries, things like this, right? We draw from international law, as most proposals of global governance do, but we are not committed to a particular interpretation of it, and we are not providing it either. We are looking for where in international law does the problem of non-ideal circumstances and detecting whether under those circumstances institutions, or in this case nations, are making progress or retrograding, like where do we find that question answered in international law? And we have found it in two places, one substantive and one procedural. So the substantive criterion that we are using, we are generalizing, shows up in international human rights law. Like 162 countries that have signed up to the conventions of the International Conventions on Human Rights have signed up to the principle of non-retrogression. That is a principle that is applied to legislative actions of states in particular, because those are the parties to the Conventions on Human Rights. And what that principle does is that it allows to assess whether a country is engaged in human rights violations in spite of the huge differences in abilities and resources, etc., between different countries. How do you know whether they are retrograding or not when what, say, Switzerland can provide and Ghana can provide in terms of like health, for example, is incomparable, right? So you need some principle that it applies to the non-ideal circumstances. So in that context, the principle of non-retrogression simply assess whether by legislation, by positive policy actions of the state, they are enforcing policies or laws that retrograde, that provide less human rights protections to the most vulnerable groups of their population. Okay, so what we do is to generalize that principle of how do we know we are not going backwards, so to say, instead of making progress, if we were to apply the proposal of institutional reform in question. We are generalizing from the actions of states, which is the only context where it shows up, at least in international human rights law for now, to global governance institutions. And the idea is that you should assess whether the proposal of reform will in somehow have an impact on the most vulnerable population in terms of the level of protection of human rights that has been achieved already. That doesn't mean that the proposals are about human rights. That doesn't mean that any proposal of reform has to have as a goal that there is no retrogression in the world. Not at all. The idea is like, no matter what you are aiming at, any other goal, like trade liberalization, like climate change, doesn't matter. Whichever goal you have, that is a constraint, the non-retrogression. Another interesting but not substantive but procedural criterion that we have identified is the constructive vote of no confidence that you find started in Germany. Karen knows more about that particular case, but it is in Spain also. I'm from Spain. So that is a procedure that prohibited, so to say, to get rid of a government if the rest of the parliament cannot agree on what the replacement government will be. And that secures that at any time there will be a government, even if there is a lot of disagreement within the parliament or whatever, right? So the idea basically that we generalize for our purposes is you cannot simply get rid of a system that has a lot of flaws if you are not going to be able to substitute or replace it with something that is at least the same in that sense that is not retrogressive with regard to the level of protection of human rights of the most vulnerable. Okay, so that to the kind of like how do we know what criteria could be used for knowing whether we are going backwards or forwards in whichever way by a proposal? And now the question is, that's more difficult and more controversial, I think, I hope, is that for any proposal that takes into account the problem of the second best, you need to kind of distinguish within your proposal which are the ideal elements that have to do with your first best strategy, the ones you want to achieve, that you think that get you closer. Because for any element under non-ideal circumstances, there will be trade-offs. There will be things you cannot do by the fact that you are choosing those elements. So, and then you could say, well, then it's making things worse, right? So how do you tell the difference? So we think that you need to identify some elements that, even though there will be trade-offs, related to the fact that you will stick to them under non-ideal circumstances and not under ideal ones. You think that they need to be there, that they cannot be sacrificed, given what goal you have. And others that are the countervailing deviations, elements that you will not need if you were under ideal circumstances, but that you think are necessary precisely if you are trying to move forward under non-ideal circumstances. And we think that for any proposal of reform, you will need to do that if your proposal is sensitive to the problem of the second best. But of course, we need to kind of show it in particular, and that means we are going to go into details about some of those elements that may apply better or worse in different cases. They fit well for the kind of example that we are going to discuss, but maybe for a different context, like a security context, for example, this is something we are not talking about. Maybe the other elements are much more salient and more important than the ones we are talking about here. Okay, so the way we do it is, I forgot the other caveat. The other caveat is that we are not, and it will make sense for this project, we are not assuming that there is a particular goal, a particular set of institutions that we think should be the way the global order is going. Like, we are completely not saying anything about it, and we're trying not to commit to anything like this, whether it should be like a global democracy or whether what we should point towards is the opposite, is like a League of Nations. Like, we don't want to get into that, and in order to avoid that, we are following Kant, because Kant did actually care a lot about the problem of the second best. So Kant give us, Karen insisted on this one, right? It's a good one, because who knows? We're just inspired by Kant. That's all we are doing with Kant.
Meme.
Okay. No, what is nice about how Kant thought about the problem in Perpetual Peace is that he realized absolutely the problem of the second best. He didn't call it this way, but you will see, if you know anything about it, you will recognize in his proposal how he was aware of that. But the thing is, because of that, he distinguished between kind of what is the end state, like what is the kind of things you need to achieve, no matter which set of institutions you propose, right? And then start thinking which set of institutions are ever likely to be realized by humans. So then we are riding on him. So he thought, for any set of institutions, what they need to be doing is to establish a rightful condition. That's how he called it. It means to solve three problems as that institution. One is the problem of assurance, to make sure that if we decided for, say, those laws, people will comply with them, right? Or else it's useless. Then you will have to solve the problem of indeterminacy. Everybody needs to know exactly what the law says, right? To agree with it. And then unilateralism, that all those who are, omnilateral, I thought we were going for.
Yeah,
but that's how he calls it, but it doesn't have the meaning of in political science, I know. Okay, so basically that it has to be what we will call democratic inclusion, that all elements to that kind of agreement should be able to see themselves as endorsing it. Okay, so basically you need a legislative, an executive branch that make sure that there is assurance or compliance. You need some kind of legislature that has democratic inclusion, that all of those to whom the law will be applied will be able to agree to it. And then you will need determinacy. You need a judicial branch that will make clear what the law says. Okay. And his idea was like, you need to solve those three problems for any set of institutions and for all kinds of interactions in the world. Taking that as the kind of like end state, he thought that republics, so democratic states, could solve those three problems at the national level, at the level he knew, right? To some extent. I mean, for him it was a regulative ideal, but much better than it had been solved in any other kind of set of political institutions. And he thought that therefore, a world republic, a democratic world state, will be the only way to actually solve these three problems for all human beings, for all ways of interaction. But he, at the same time, and that's the beauty of perpetual peace, that's why people keep fighting about what it really means and what happened and what he is proposing, he thought that this was unavailable. And that it was never going to happen with human beings for different reasons, and the literature is completely divided about why, and that's why I'm saying unavailable, not unfeasible. For sure, he thought at least that it was unavailable, and so then he made a second best proposal, what he himself called a surrogate. He knew and explained why that wasn't going to solve the problem, that wasn't going to create a rightful condition, but it was probably the best that humans could aspire for, namely a League of Nations, and gave all the reasons why a League of Nations will never really do it, but it was kind of the second best for humans. So to the extent that he thought in exactly the way that we are thinking, we are using Kant in that way, riding on the rightful condition and being non-committal about what set of institutions actually will be the end goal, because I think we still need to figure out how to get there, and everybody should kind of be on board on that question, even if the end goal is kind of different. So using that simply, in the paper then we try to identify the ideal elements, the approximation elements that we think one should identify, but there could be others, as I said. Now we are going into a more particular level of argument. And then some deviant elements, something that takes care of the fact that you realize that you are under non-ideal conditions. And so in our case, we argue for multilateralism, publicity, and contestation as things that you want to keep no matter what kind of proposal you are making. And as deviant elements, national constitutional checks and affordable non-compliance. Those are like the sand in the wheels. Those are the typical things that in some sense do not let you go fast enough towards your goal, right? They are things that allow actors, or like those implied in your proposal, to kind of not move forward, right? But we think that is needed in the circumstances. The example we use to kind of motivate why is that under a fragmented system, as what we have now in global governance, if you try to solve, to reach a rightful condition only with one particular institution that has a particular mandate, for example, the WTO, if you try to make hard law, whatever the WTO does, and make sure that there be compliance and determinacy, etc., it can happen, and it's something that we use later also in the example of the WTO, that you get, for example, the prioritization of intellectual property rights. You create a very strong system of intellectual property rights that make it much harder for you later to solve the problem, for example, of the global burden of disease. You create a lot of private rights for medicines, for example, and then when you try to later solve the problem of global burden of disease, that is already a constraint. You can only solve it to the extent that you do not go against property rights of medicines or patents. If things had gone the other way, you could have first tried to solve the problem of the global burden of disease, and then you will have thought about intellectual property rights only within the limits that do not make it impossible to solve the problem, right? You see the difference. So it matters in a fragmented world which problem you solve first. You may not want to create assurance and compliance so long as you don't have democratic inclusion, so long as it's not clear who is setting the priorities about what that institution does, what needs to be done first, what is the constraint, right? And for that, you may need deviant elements. You may need actors to be able to step out because they may, for example, as it happened in the particular case I'm talking about, of TRIPS, the Agreement on Intellectual Property Rights, and those countries like Brazil and South Africa, etc., who were actually using what we will call affordable non-compliance. They were just not going to comply to TRIPS and kind of exercise civil disobedience and see what happens, right? So that's kind of the model. Let's start with like some of the examples. I don't know how long I'm talking, but if I go for too long, Karen, you tell me, because I lose track. Okay, so with regard to multilateralism, right, we think that multilateralism is preferable to any kind of bilateralism or ad hoc agreements, right? If you got so far as to have a system that somehow adheres to generalized principles, right, you are getting closer to a possibility of democratic inclusion. Whereas if you kind of go back to ad hoc bilateral agreements, then you are going back to non-principles that everybody is following. You go back to simply reflecting the threat advantage of the parties in question that are going bilateral. And because it also is not ideal, like it's not full inclusion yet, but it allows all, like to the extent that it's multilateral in spirit and it adheres to generalized principles, is likely to have an option to opt in, so to say. So it gets you, even if it's not ideal, it gets you multilateralism, gets you to possibly total inclusion, whereas moving from multilateralism to bilateralism is actually moving away from any kind of democratic inclusion. That doesn't mean multilateralism comes at no cost. So, but that's kind of like, how do you make the difference? The idea is like, if you are very committed to establishing a rightful condition, you don't give up on multilateralism in spite of the trade-offs. Maybe you give up on other things, right? That's kind of the argument. Publicity is similar. Publicity has a lot of trade-offs. Publicity can be a problem. It may not allow you to get negotiations going, for example. If everybody's aware, there is positioning. I mean, there's a bunch of literature showing how behind closed doors it's easier to get to an agreement than under the gaze of publicity. But there still is that type of like element where you are like, okay, publicity at least is a requirement for the outcome, to justify the outcome, the laws, the policies, the whatever it is that the decision is about, to justify publicly why that is good or is something that people should endorse, right? To us, that is something you cannot renounce to, even if it comes at a cost, because you can always, by via of public justification, get there, right? By increasing publicity, you may get people to endorse it, and by reducing publicity in that regard, you can never get there, right? Whereas we accept the possibility, obviously, that the perception of transparency may not always apply to the process, the procedure, how you got there, right? Maybe you need negotiation behind closed doors, but the outcome has to be possibly publicly justifiable so that people can endorse it and see why they have to follow it. The other element is contestation as a kind of like check and balances structure. That's something that to us actually counts as ideal. It's not something that you just cannot avoid, and therefore eventually you want to get rid of. Contestation will always be the way you secure inclusion, not only formally but de facto, how actually actors, by contesting decisions, can actually be able to have a say on them and change them. And particularly, it will always write in our proposal whenever the price you are paying, the reason why something is contested by some of the actors that belong to that kind of institution or whatever it is that it will be retrogressive for the human rights of the most vulnerable part of the population. That will always be a reason for contestation. That is kind of, in that sense, ideal, not just simply, a compromise or something. This national constitutional checks are one way of contestation that is happening, of course, for countries that have that type of constitutional democracies. Then we go to the non-ideal elements, right? Usually, if what you're trying to, for example, solve is the problem of assurance of compliance, really you don't want that, right? The idea is that what the problem is precisely that the bad actors are not compliant, right? But we are saying, okay, well, yes, there is a lot of concern about that, especially when it comes to jus cogens issues, right? Mass atrocities, war crimes, etc. For all of those issues, you do not want to have non-compliance being affordable. You actually want to increase the cost of non-compliance for bad actors, right? But that's not the case for all other decisions on trade liberalization or many economic issues, for example, is not the same as jus cogens, right? So then for us, there has to be affordable non-compliance. Certainly, according, obviously, with our own argument, when the reason why a nation or a particular actor, depends on what institution we're talking about, is non-compliant, has to do with they not be able to provide the level of protection of human rights of the most vulnerable that they had already achieved, right? But there could also be, and we kind of open up the possibility that there could be non-compliance simply, even though they will always have cost, and it should have, but it should not be so non-affordable that it's impossible for the countries in question or for wherever the actors are, right? It could also be something that can be legitimately used, although non-ideally, to preserve democratic choice. And one example we have, I think, in the paper, if it's still there, is the debate in Europe between the European Union and the United States on the meaning of the precautionary principle, right? With the debates, it's not taken, not there. Okay, so forget that. But in any event, so preserving democratic choice, in our view, is not as well justified because there is a lot of leeway of differences of how democratic choice is thought of in different contexts, right? It's not so obviously part of it, but so long as it were in compliance, so long as by itself, the going into that direction will not necessarily have that impact on the basic human rights of other human beings in other places, it could possibly be acceptable for the reasons of democratic inclusion in a world where we don't have something like a global democracy. Okay, and now Karen's going to illustrate what happens if you believe in this in the example of the WTO.
Yeah. So the problem of the second best is that for whatever reason, the first best that you want to achieve is not possible. And if it's not possible, it is not the case that making step-by-step reform in the direction of the first best is the right strategy. The first best gives you no roadmap, and in fact, it may give you a really problematic roadmap. So then, if you can't use the first best as your roadmap, then you need a different roadmap. The different roadmap then is a set of normative criteria for second best governance. And so you don't even start with the first best, you start with second best. And what Cristina was laying out is we said, okay, we're going to define a form of second best governance that will then be your roadmap of what types of reforms you can do. And we took that from Kant and said that Kant recognized that to establish a rightful condition, you need certain elements, and that you could imagine would be the roadmap to a global governance ideal system, a world state. But since you're not going to get a world state, if you were doing an approximation of strategy, which is the wrong thing to do, you would be starting to move in every step you could towards the ideal of a world state that would give you these criteria of assurance and indeterminacy and things like that. And that since that's not the right strategy, you want to avoid an approximation of strategy and instead use your second best criteria as your guideline. And then we define 5 second best criteria, 3 which are about Kantian ideals, and 2 of which deviated. And Cristina got the numbers a little bit off. The national constitutional checks is a deviating element, which says that even though you've made this international obligation, you get to break this obligation if following the obligation would undermine your constitution. So that's one way you get out of violating international law. And the second way you get out is what we're calling affordable noncompliance, which is that you choose not to follow the law. It's not costless. There is a cost to it, but the cost can't be such that it's impossible. It still has to be a democratic choice that you can make to not comply and pay the cost. And then I didn't want to go into more detail, but this is where she was going with the precautionary principle. Europe still does not allow beef with hormones, and the US retaliates, and that's their choice. If they don't want to let beef with hormones in, even though it violates the WTO rules, they do it anyway. It becomes affordable. So you want affordable noncompliance for all. So now we want to take this set of ideas that I just recapped and think about it in the context of the WTO. So if we were going to do an approximationist strategy, if we were going to go towards the Kantian ideal, which is our placeholder of an ideal, we would want to improve assurance, omnilateralism, and determinacy, which means we would want to try to improve executive oversight. And we would be thinking about proposals that would allow the WTO Secretariat to monitor compliance and maybe following the EU bring cases of noncompliance to some kind of system that would deal with them. And we would be thinking about how to improve a legislative and democratic input system. So we might be thinking about, let's improve the committee structure of the WTO. And we would be thinking about how can we make the judicial branch work better, make WTO law supreme. If we're concerned that it doesn't have checks, add human rights to it. And we would want to constitutionalize the WTO system. That's if we're using a roadmap towards an ideal, a Kantian ideal, that's the conversation we would be having. But instead, we said we want second best governance. And we are going to try to use our second best criteria to think about what kinds of reforms you might want. And so we're thinking about, we have the second best, which were those 5 criteria that we laid out: multilateralism, publicity, I'm forgetting the third, and then the deviating of national constitutional checks and affordable noncompliance. What are the factors in the WTO that are actually making our second best governance worse? And how do we then improve upon them? And we're going to say what reforms might promote the desired and acceptable goals of our second best global governance, because we can't use the first best as our roadmap. Okay. So the big issues that are in the moment, another thing we're doing that's different in this paper is we're going to think about the current problems of the WTO and think about how do you address these problems. We're not going to imagine problems based on our theory, but actually look at what's going on in the WTO. So we identified 3 problems. The paper's already too long. It's got to be cut down to 13,000 words. It's going to have to end up with 2 problems. But so that's why we're only doing 3. One problem is that inside of the WTO, these preferential trade agreements are proliferating. Preferential trade agreements would be any subset of member states can come up with an agreement that is more liberalizing. And if it's more liberalizing, they can give extra free trade benefits to whoever opts in to this preferential trade agreement. At the start of the WTO, they've always allowed these side preferential trade agreements, and they were there for the imperial preference system of Britain and for all empires. They still wanted to give preferred market access to their colonial partners. And then when the EU came along, they still wanted, the European community wanted to open up its market even more to European member states. And so you had this exception from the beginning. But what has happened in the last 20 years is that it's become like a free-for-all. And any side agreement that can be negotiated is basically rubber-stamped by the WTO. And what that's doing is it's meaning that you no longer negotiate inside of the WTO. You negotiate among groups of like-minded states. And the WTO becomes less relevant as a trade policy making. The cornerstone of the WTO is most favored nation status. Whatever trade deal you give to one country gets given to every other country. At this point, there was a report that I'm going to reference called the Sutherland Report, found that the European community had only like 5 countries that it even traded with under most favored nation status. Every other trading relationship in the world was governed by a preferential trade agreement. So the number one benefit of why you want in the WTO club so that you get the best deals as everyone else gets undermined by these PTAs. And these preferential trade agreements can also be introducing intellectual property retrogression. So that's a big problem that the WTO is facing. A second big problem is the dispute settlement system. And the main problem with the dispute settlement system right now is that the United States is so completely pissed off about it that it's blocking any appointments to the appellate body. And by the end of 2019, it's going to be non-functional. There are not going to be enough judges to even have a quorum. And the dispute has to do with the zeroing policy. That's what's so pissed off the United States. But Another thing animating the disputes, and this is widely shared even if only the United States is obnoxiously voicing it, is that there's all kinds of things that China is doing that cannot be redressed through the WTO system, either because the rules are not there in the WTO system or because they're written in such a way that China is kind of skirting, especially with its state-owned enterprises. So the dispute settlement system is no longer working for the major trading partners in a way that they're satisfied with, and it's therefore being blocked and shutting down. The third problem that comes from the preferential trade agreements is making sure that least developed countries are then not cut out of global policy making, that their interests don't get permanently left out. And already within the WTO system, they have a really hard time because the dispute settlement system doesn't create affordable non-compliance for least developed countries. The PTA cuts least developed countries out of trade policy making and PTA agreements, and PTAs can reintroduce, undermine the bargains that developing countries fought for really hard inside of the WTO. So these are the three problems that we're going to then think about what roadmap to reform to address these problems. And I'm going to just go very quickly, and in question and answer we can go into this more. So we want to think about proposals that protect these second best features, multilateralism, publicity, and contestation at the local, national, and transnational level. We think for democracy, contestation is good, and that allow national constitutional checks and affordable noncompliance. But there are other goals that you could allow besides these goals. We'll also accept any proposal that improves the situation of the most vulnerable and any change that improves any of these second best features. That is our roadmap. That's our second best roadmap that I want to now apply to those three issues that I just laid out. Okay, so if we had the problem with PTAs and we're following our second best roadmap, our second best roadmap would say that the WTO needs to increase its oversight of PTAs. If preferential trade agreements are undermining the benefits of being in the WTO, then the WTO needs to start disallowing any agreement that substantively undermines the benefits of WTO membership. It already has the oversight mechanisms to do so. It's just that it rubber stamps pretty much any PTA, and it would need to stop doing that. There are other things you could do too. You could also say all WTO members can opt into PTAs. You could, but then you have the problem with China because the main reason that countries are making PTAs at this point is to exclude China. Okay, so you would want something that puts the proliferation of PTAs under WTO management. That would be how you deal with that problem. How you would deal with the problem with dispute settlement is you would, if the problem with dispute settlement is that least developed countries are cut out and can't actually afford not to comply, and what they really want is compensation, you would want to address the concerns of the least developed countries inside dispute settlement. So maybe you'd want like compulsory compensation, and maybe you would even think about compulsory compensation outside of the WTO system, like non-repayment of loans, or like being able to take a WTO victory, a court win, and take it like a foreign judgment and be able to enforce that foreign judgment for a certain amount anywhere in the world. That's the New York Convention. Or this was the Mexico proposal that you could auction off your retaliation rights. If you couldn't affordably retaliate, maybe you could sell that right to Europe and let Europe affordably retaliate. That was Mexico's idea. There are many other things that you could also do. As I said, there was a Sutherland report, and they had all kinds of things that were also about improving our second best global governance. They were rules to retain appellate body members until their term runs out, or until they're replaced. Open hearings, more amicus briefs, special expert review. So there are other things that you could do to make the system work well, as long as you don't undermine the second best goals. You don't introduce more retrogression. For TRIPS, there's a whole series of proposals that one would allow, and to just go really quickly. You could eliminate TRIPS because TRIPS actually was passed violating second best global governance, and you could eliminate it without actually undermining anything. You could add what Thomas Poggi and others have talked about of a global health fund that might have compulsory licensing. That would not violate our second best criteria. You could not eliminate the WTO. But you could replace the WTO with a new constitutional bargain as long as it doesn't include retrogression. And you could accept more reforms, more opt-outs, more publicity, as long as it doesn't compromise the second best global governance. So I've just thrown a lot at you by going through these proposals, but let me just try to wrap up. One thing we allow is this constructive vote of no confidence. You could choose to replace the WTO. If you're not happy with the current WTO, you could say, I want to replace it. And you could replace it as long as you don't undermine the second best governance goals that we've already achieved and get below them. So there are many ways you could think. They don't actually talk about, no one's talking right now about a new constitutional bargain for the WTO. I think they should, but they're not, because they would rather create trade through preferential trade agreements. But there's all kinds of ways that you could adjust the current set of rules to make it more to the member states' liking. You'd have to not take the WTO rules right now as an acquis communautaire that could not be changed. You'd have to open it up. Open up what counts as the least developed country. Open up the balance of concessions that you're agreeing to. Make a new trade-related bargain as long as it is not retrogressive to the least developed countries. Okay, so conclusions. What we're trying to do in this paper is define the problem of the second best as it applies to global governance. And as we understand, most people are focused on ideal theories. Most people are imagining a constitution or something like that, and they're using those as roadmaps of where to go. And we're taking the problem of the second best and saying, we know this for many other areas. Global governance people, you need to be talking about this as well. The problem of the second best is that the first best strategy provides no roadmap. And every time you use the first best strategy, you risk falling into what we're calling the approximation trap. Of all these new words we threw at you that you didn't already know, the approximation trap is the only one we invented. Okay? And that is the idea that any proposal that is about approximating the ideal may or may not be the right way. You have to be thinking about the second best criteria that you want to defend. Our second best criteria tell us contestation is good, national checks are good, non-compliance is good, because we are caring about democracy and we're caring about protecting the rights of the least vulnerable. And so you need a system that is constantly allowing contestation, constantly allowing national constitutional checks designed to protect the most vulnerable, and at the limit, allowing non-compliance, not for free, but in a way that allows you to choose to protect the most vulnerable. And also the joys of interdisciplinary collaboration. Co-authoring with a philosopher is a new and different challenge for me, and she would say the same thing with me. There are many things we have not answered, okay? The goal of this paper is to highlight the problem of the second best and how it works. You could still have many more conversations about what are acceptable reforms, because even the second best roadmap is incomplete. You could also need to think about the unintended consequences of whatever you're doing that might come in down the road. And you could even say, well, why are you stressing checks, accountability, and contestation? I want a different set of goals. And we just pick those goals to illustrate the problem of second best. They happen to also be goals that we believe in. And you should say, well, maybe there's another way. If democracy is a goal you're saying is important, maybe there's another way to protect democracy. And that's another conversation that you could have. But we're not going in all these directions because the point of the paper is to talk about the problem of the second best. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I know there's a lot of pieces, and we'll open this up now for discussion and conversation. So come on up, Cristina. And
Do you want to bring chairs over there, because it might take quite long?
Forever, right?
Forever, sure.
Standing forever.
Yeah, an hour or so.
Okay. Hopefully you followed it, and we can maybe start with clarificatory questions, just about what we talked about, and then challenges. Were there any pieces? We threw so much at you so quickly.
And you seem to be very authoritative, so maybe you can just chair, or do you want me to chair? And
Up to you, whatever you want to do.
I think if somebody else is chair.
Yeah, Jan, why don't you chair, because you know. Yeah. Okay.
That releases me from putting the first question, because
Or you
I am
can
the
take.
chair, so I should wait for questions from the audience. So do we have some?
Yeah.
So why don't we start with you?
So this is completely new to me, but I agree very much with your account, with some of the principles that you lined up for measuring what's the second best. But some of the goals that you mentioned, such as accountability and transparency, are immeasurable in my world. How do you measure it? I mean, as you also said, there can be conflicting. There's a dilemma also because too much transparency can be a problem in negotiations. And so how do you measure that when you are to lay down your roadmap for your second phase? Have you thought about that?
Oh, I would rephrase that question. Let me rephrase it and then let Cristina answer it. Because the goal is publicity and not necessarily transparency. And we have a very specific meaning about publicity, which would hopefully help you. We're not so concerned about measuring it in terms of like a quantitative study, but help you at least think about it. So the publicity goal.
But actually, I mean, the way we think about it, it's not a big deal how to know. Like, do we know, for example, like we have it in the paper, that the WTO allows for publicity at a much higher level than GATT ever did, right? So we're interested in how much publicity a particular institution grants to the public, to others, and whether they are partners or not. And there even we restricted, like you need to know what it is that justifies, what is the rationale that justifies the particular policy or whatever that has been enforced, such that it can possibly be contested. That's the point. So it's not so much that you can endorse it also, but that you know, right? And so that is something that you can measure in a way, like a philosopher is extraordinary that I would say that because I know nothing about measuring, but in a way when you read about, for example, the fights about how much publicity there is at the WTO, I get the impression that those who are pushing for more or less publicity know exactly what is available and what is not. Right? Something I know about, in particular the case of the WTO, but also the IMF and the World Bank, is that a lot of people who think that those institutions, particularly the World Bank, have been engaging in providing like loans for infrastructural projects that were not protecting human rights of those in those countries, right? Were concerned about having publicity of how those decisions were reached, not necessarily how it was negotiated, but kind of like, okay, what considerations were made public such that they can contest them? And the fact that there was no local participation, for example, if you can prove that, right, then you show that it was not sufficiently public, right? So those are examples in which it's not clear that measuring it is a problem to the extent that you are asking for access to the rationale and the outcome. If you were asking about having access to the proceedings of the negotiation, that would be a step that we are not necessarily saying is better. So you could also want that. I'm not sure you want, because sometimes you do want to get somewhere, right? But you don't want to get somewhere in such a way that nothing is transparent enough for the public sphere to have access to and to know how that has been done. So that's
So let me just add something as a
thinking.
non-philosopher, because everything Shoa says I have to kind of like dumb down for a way that makes sense to me. So I understand the Kantian definition of publicity is that the end goal has to be able to be made public and defended in a public way. And so if you're doing something secret, you know, that you don't want anyone to ever know about, that's telling you you're violating the principle of publicity. You don't have to say how the sausage was made, but you have to be able to say at the end of the day, this is the sausage and you should want to eat this sausage because it's doing all of these good things. And I should be able to convince you that the sausage is something worth making and eating. How it was made doesn't mean I have to show you every single step along the way. I just have to be able to publicly defend it. That is, as I understand it, the Kantian requirement of publicity. And therefore, it's only an end goal obligation, not necessarily a means obligation along the way, which is why along the way maybe there's certain things you wouldn't want to be transparent. That's my understanding.
The example I was giving about the World Bank, because I forgot, is they ended up, because of the pressure, having an inspection panel. It's the first time ever in the history of global governance institutions that there is a panel in a global governance institution to which individuals can appeal to know whether the World Bank has followed some procedures, the things it's committed to, right? That is how you will know, right? If you have that type of panel, you are making progress on publicity compared to when you cannot even know how the institution is working. That would be.
All right, I have Shai next on the list.
I'm trying to understand exactly the problem with the first best. I can think of two situations. One is when you say the problem with the first best is you try to approximate and you end up in the worst situation, guaranteed, 100%. And here I think nobody would argue with you that it's a bad thing. I mean, the actions are in a way misguided, even if they are coming from good intentions. Another possibility to think about it is you're trying to reach a better result, and you may have an intermediate period where results will be significantly worse, and then it will get better, or it will be better for some people and worse for others. And here, what is required from you is some theory of either making it commensurable of the suffering of different people, or if it's across the time, some theory of a discount rate. Now, what I'm asking of you, if what you're doing is you are offering a theory that is motivated by consequentialism, explain. Maybe you're not.
No,
you're not. So is it? So
Clearly not.
So,
okay,
yeah,
okay.
so the problem of second best is not our theory.
Yes.
Okay, and when it was designed as actually a formal model theory by an economist,
Okay.
what he said is it's not guaranteed that going for the first best will make things worse, but he would say, he said, Lipson and Lancaster said, if our goal is to maximize the welfare of our society, that's our goal, our ideal, and that everything that we might do in tax reform, we would think would actually get us towards that goal. If you had Pareto improvements and you only allowed an improvement that actually made no one worse off and everyone better off. And he showed through the formal model that even with that criteria, you would get to outcomes that were less welfare enhancing. So the problem of the first best is that it doesn't necessarily give you a map. Now, it could well be that there is a map to get there, and you still want, in our second best reform, is to still get to a place you want to go. It's just that you can't use your first best ideal as the map. That is the problem of the second best. And if the first best ideal can't be your map, then you need a different map.
Yes, and the question is what normatively justifies your map? If it's not any consequentialist theory, I read the paper, I'm not sure I understand what is the normative justification for these principles. Is it some deontological principle that you basically analyze and break down? Yeah.
So
Say two things first,
Okay.
because of something you said. You were bringing three types of problems, and not all of them are the problem of the second best. The problem of unintended consequences is beyond the second best, because that is a problem for anybody. Because by saying unintended means that it could not be foreseeable, and therefore, what are you going to do about it? Like, you can have a plan about that one, right? I mean, you may try to improve your foreseeable capacities, but in general, unintended consequences are a problem for no matter which map you take. The problem is that those for the second best are not unintended. You could foresee, but that's why they could show it with formal models, right? The idea is like, it's not that in general there will be unintended consequences that you could not possibly have foreseen. It's that the problem of the second best is something you can foresee in particular cases, and that is the attempt to say, how do we distinguish those unforeseeable things? We will cope with them whenever they arise. The thing is like, no, there are some things that are not unforeseeable that you should have known, and therefore when you change institutions, you need to take that into account in order not to go there. So it's a much more reduced case than the case where you will also introduce the fact that. Then you were also talking, and that's more to the question that you really are interested in, what if it's better for some and worse for others? Okay. In some way that is unavoidable, like that can be a problem for any roadmap, right? But our criteria is really very, very non-ambitious in the sense that, how do you know the difference? Two aspects. One, not everybody is the most vulnerable person, right, as far as international human rights conventions are concerned. To be most vulnerable really has to be your life is at stake, you really have no capacity to eat. I mean, we are talking about the bottom line we know about in international human rights law. So you cannot give a loan to India for a gigantic infrastructural project that displaces 1 million people without having for them any livelihood whatsoever. You can't do that. That's what we are talking about. That's how it shows up in international human rights law. So you can't do that one. It's not unforeseeable. If you move 1 million people to a place, displace them in a place where they have no way to earn a living, these people are going to die. So that's actually what happened with some of those infrastructure projects. So that is what we are kind of saying, this is how you count retrogression, because that is in fact how international human rights law tries to count which actions count as retrogressive. So the most vulnerable as what we choose and what is chosen in that criterion, yes, still will need to be defended, but I think it is unlikely to be the most questionable part of what we are defending, right? Whereas if it were like it has to be Pareto optimality, then it depends for whom and what counts as better. I think when it comes to basic human rights like life, health, access to food, for some people, then you are really hitting bottom line. That's what we are using. And the same with like going from having some kind of system to having zero. So our view, you may have noticed, is not revolutionary, it's reformist, right? That is the vote of non-confidence, right, proposal. That is what we really need to justify in a way, or to count on. And we are ecumenical in the sense that I think it doesn't matter whether you defend why the life of the most vulnerable should be like the bottom line in your criterion. You can do that deontologically, you can do consequences, it doesn't matter. The idea is like, this is something that at least 162 countries in the world have kind of accepted as the criterion to know which state actor is violating the fundamental rights of the most vulnerable, right? And we are kind of like piggybacking on that. It can be questioned, but for me, it will have to be questioned with an alternative that is less questionable. Yeah. Like, if anybody asks me seriously, why is it the fundamental human rights of the most vulnerable your criterion? I will ask, okay, tell me what will be the alternative, and then we can discuss it in particular.
But we try to avoid getting into the detailed conversation by just saying you need a second best that has a normative basis. And we're not going to defend this one, but we're just going to tell you what ours is, which is promoting democracy and non-retrogression for the most vulnerable. And if that's your second best criteria, that's your roadmap. Not the first best is not your roadmap. Your second best criteria is your roadmap. And so we're offering you one, but we're not going to spend a lot of time, because we have huge word limits in this paper, defending that particular one. But Cristina has a whole body of literature which she defends these on. So you can read over stuff. Yeah. Hopefully that answers.
Let's move on to other questions, and Annalisa is another one.
There's very much actually in continuance of what you just asked and what you just said, because I was wondering where your normative choice comes from. So that's very much the same as you said. And I think in a way also, I always also had the impression that there is, in a way, some kind of a universalist claim in what you're saying, just what you said. So there's something in that as well, that you will, the most vulnerable, the vulnerability of people, persons, is somehow the criterion that is the bottom line or something like that, and that one would have to come up with other criteria to somehow convince you that there could be another choice. So in my mind, that sounds as if there's a universalist claim in what you're saying.
Can I take
your normative position? But
right.
No, so
I'm going to take it, because in co-teaching with a philosopher, this is what I learned about philosophy, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that the name of the game in philosophy is to lay out a normative line, and then no matter what someone throws at you, you can defend it. And so believe me, she can do that. And, and so as we were thinking of co-authoring, and how we could come together and agree on something, and that I can't get in that conversation with her, but overall I think she's got, we agree enough, otherwise we couldn't co-author. We'll just take a theory that is consistent with her entire thing, because a philosopher will not compromise on their normative theory. She has spent years of her career developing, defending this normative theory. That's what they do for a living. You cannot compromise on that. But we don't want to go, she has a whole body of literature, and there's no value added to me as a collaboration if we go on that. So what we're doing is we're saying it's the problem of the second best. You need a normative criteria, but the problem still works even if you said, I don't want to take Cristina's Habermasian Kantian idea. I want to take someone else's libertarian crazy idea and make that my second best. That's fine. You just need a second best roadmap, and it's that roadmap, not the first best. And then it's a different conversation. So that's why we're just asserting these criteria and then citing her and saying, go read it all, and saying that that's the roadmap.
Let me just add one thing. The thing is, like, no one who cares about the second best cannot have a substantive criteria for non-retrogression, because the second best is a worry about whether you are retrograding under non-ideal. So the idea is, like, my criterion, I'm taking it from international law, and that way I'm kind of like, I have only need the universalism that international law has been able to achieve, right? The idea is that, okay, that is a principle of international law that countries have kind of like agreed to. As we all know, that doesn't mean anything, so it will need to be defended, right? we cannot defend in this paper, it's clear to me too, but it is like what you need to defend is why the human rights of the most vulnerable. That you need a non-retrogression criteria is not bring by us, it's literally like what the second best criterion requires, namely a substantive one and a procedural one, and that we're taking those, right? But yes, I have written a lot on the principle of non-retrogression in my other papers and on human rights, because I work on human rights. But still, I know I'm a philosopher, I'm very aware that it will be very hard for me to defend any kind of criteria from scratch based on nothing. It's interesting when you can piggyback on international law, because for whatever reason, countries have been able to get there. And that to me makes a difference even as a philosopher, whether you are like, I don't need I can rely on the human rights project already existing and giving us principles that are in international law for our purposes. So I'm really actually being humble. I do not have a theory that justifies out of nowhere why human rights. No, I don't have that, just in case she thinks I do, I don't.
Right, so unfortunately we do have a philosopher to test Christina's capability to defend her normative ground, so.
We wouldn't want to go there with an endless debate over where there's nothing at stake because we do not budge an inch. No, I was more interested in I very much appreciated a lot of what you said insofar that I could follow you. It was a bit quick and I didn't apologize for not managing to read the whole thing. But it seemed to me, in latching on to what you mentioned, that your approach is, or you're inclined to working in a non-revolutionary reformist sense. And I was just wondering how your whole model adapts if we're looking at a problematique that is fundamentally asking a much more really a from scratch question rather than the immediate race question that we can say that WTO supplies us with, because there we already have an institution that is existing. And a lot of what you said, I think, for instance, translates well to your work on the European Court of Human Rights, the reform we just went through, and all the strategies and how to reform this in a way that doesn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. But if we look to an area that I've been working in international criminal law, there was, in a sense at least, we can always say that things are in medias res, but in a sense it's completely from scratch. There was no effective global governance, no international criminal code. There was just different historical events of what one could call victorious justice. So there you would have, and I'm interested what that does to your model, that it seems that the status quo is the opposite of global governance, or the absence of global governance. And if you are arguing in favor of some kind of status quo bias, as you say, then how would we ever get even to the second best version here of this? And I think, just if I may suggest then one small thing, one of the issues then is how best to describe the status quo, latching on to what we had before, say, 1998 or 1995 when we had the ad hoc tribunals, where we would say, well, there is an absence of these institutions. So in that sense, the status quo is complete lack of regulation. But we could also say that we have a lot of countries that domestically prosecute, have a criminal law systems, and unanimously seem to, it's a truly human universal that we criminalize certain kinds of events and systematically prosecute them. So in that sense, we could say status quo is just being expanded by moving from the domestic to the international level. Or I'm more, it's a question of clarification, and I'd like to hear your point.
Yes, because I think what I have said can be misunderstood. So in the case, particularly on international criminal law, I think is the strongest case for anything, because that falls under Judge Kagan. So I think there's simply like a very different kind of debate than in the economy, for example. But when I said that it's not a revolutionary approach, doesn't mean that it doesn't allow you to create things from scratch. Like going from even universal jurisdiction, I'm absolutely in favor. So you can create something, because there is no sense in which, frankly, as far as, at least as the second best is concerned, because I don't know, there can always be unintended consequences. But in principle, for making the question of assurance and compliance stronger when it comes to international criminal law, I think there is a case there, absolutely, and I don't even see how there could be even non-intended consequences, although we have negated some of them. But in principle, our approach doesn't say anything against creating from scratch a global governance system for international criminal law, absolutely, in whichever way. You will have to take into account, right, the ways in which it may backfire, whatever, there is a space for the second best, but not in the sense I said, nothing revolutionary, you cannot change the status quo. What I mean by revolutionary is literally someone who thinks like the situation of human rights in the world is so bad that we need to go to war, like we need to kind of kill the powerful actors, destroy the whole system, not just the WTO, wherever it is, we need First World War, Second World War, whichever, right? I have nothing to say, but certainly what I can say is that our approach doesn't apply for that situation. So if somebody's in that or claims that is the way to go, our paper says zero about it. That's what I meant. The idea, because there you accept the possibility. For example, if you go to war, that a lot of people are going to die because that's what it will take, and that by the time you try to get the better system, a lot of people will have died, their human rights will have it, right? And so in that way, that's something we couldn't accommodate in our paper. However, creating new forms of governance that obviously improve, right, on the human rights of people, right, like having something like this, is not what I meant by saying that is a status quo bias, not so much a status quo bias, right? No, the whole idea is to create new things. The idea is like, how much can you destroy in creating the new thing that affects the human rights of most people? Can you just go to war and accept that millions of people will die? Well, I'm not sure, right? With my criterion, you couldn't, I guess, right? But I'm not sure that your case is excluded by that.
But our constructive vote of no confidence, I mean, you said, and what you said was, there was a system, very decentralized, very bad. There was national enforcement, very ad hoc. And you could see the ICC as a constructive vote of no confidence to replace that system with something entirely new that did not violate what was already there or in a retrogressive way. So, you know, if you want to say, what she means by revolutionary, we also call it eliminationist. Something like, let's just eliminate it and then see what happens. That we don't allow, because we require the constructive vote of no confidence. You would have to first replace it with something that is better according to our second best criteria or whatever second best criteria you're going to use.
All right, I have kept my boss waiting for too long, so I hope Mikhail will not retaliate. So, Mikhail.
That's my second best, you know.
Yeah.
So apparently I've been thinking along the lines of second best already without knowing, but now enlightened. So there is, of course, something in the criteria that you put up for your second best that do have a taste of the best. You know, they
Right.
do smell a bit like something going somewhere that, you know. So I'm not completely convinced of the separation. You know, there is they seem frighteningly close in some ways, you know. So
How do I?
at least procedurally, you know,
Okay.
maybe substantively. You know?
Well,
So that's the one thing. That of course I know how you line all those things, easy word. But there's also something more, and now I'm going to challenge you, Cristina, because is Kant really the best? I mean, that's a big assumption. That really is that the best? This naive thought about a global republic, you know, it's just, you know, but it does matter here that making that the best for what can then not be, well, can be then the second best because cannot be the best anymore, you know. So it, you know, it does introduce a normative space for you to maneuver in that is, I'll just say, you know, defined as such. So that there's something there, because it does come in also an empirical example, because the WTO, to reform that according to the line of second best, I would challenge that it was ever devised in line with the best, as understood in this paper. You know, it was always some kind of second best, if not fifth best, really,
Yes.
to be honest. So it's much lower down. So actually you are, even though you don't want to become yet another constitutionalist, you know, and I fully agree with that. But actually considering the reality of it, empirically speaking, that is so low that what you then suggest, because it has a flavor of the best, actually sounds a little bit like, I say, a bit of going precisely in that direction, you know. So that is something that you should think about. And then a final question, that's really from my own work. So the contestation, the checks, which is a huge issue. We know that very well. And it's just in human rights law, though, it very often, some examples, of course, that you tend to take the positive side of it, but very often the checks on human rights is not in favor of the vulnerable. You know, the domestic checks on whatever international law do that. So it can have a quite negative, of course, and you can say that by regression and so on, but nevertheless that is what we know empirically. Then and also we also know very well that to check within substantive matters is quite different from checking the authority. So the moment you challenge authority in the, what's left then? So I see there's some place you need to convince this broader audience. I think that you need to give a few arguments why.
You want it? Okay. So several things. Okay. So the commitment that is essential to the paper or our approach is the non-retrogression criterion be bound to the fundamental human rights of the most vulnerable. That is something that, however, I refuse to say that this is ideal because I really hope we can do better than that. I mean, really, that is, I don't know if we are all aware of how the human rights situation in the world is. To me, that is not even it's not even priority to the most vulnerable. It's like in terms of normative principle, it's the lowest of the lowest. So, however, I'm committed to that. However, when you say Kant and multilateralism, the flavor of constitutionalism, okay, no, that we are showing the cards. That's when she says democracy, for example, right? So the idea is if we want to say you need to distinguish between ideal elements and deviant elements, we cannot do that if we want to give examples without picking some ideal elements. And so we are doing that. We're literally taking multilateral publicity, fine. But we have three levels of argument. One is to say you need to take care no matter who you are. You are a complete libertarian, absolutely don't believe even in human rights protection because you think you have to protect yourself. Whatever it is you are, okay, you need to worry about the second best, and you need to have a criterion about how do you distinguish between retrograding or not in advance for things that can be foreseeable. Of course, for everything that is not foreseeable is okay. So that is our kind of where we think we are neutral, and we are literally telling people you need to worry about this. That's first level. Next level is that, okay, what is a criterion that makes sense? We look international law, we pick what we like. However, that pick is fundamental for us, but it's a very low pick. You understand, right? Because for all we are saying, any reform is possible that will still have the bottom billion not having access to food. That's what I'm saying. So that for me is not ideal, really. It's when I do ideal theory, I try to do better than that. Okay. Now, in the ideal part, yes, there is democracy, right? As democratic inclusion in decision making. So it's not democratic, as you are pointing out. The problem is that having state actors as proxies for peoples is pretty bad because there's a lot of very bad actors, very bad states, and so they aren't really democratic. So when we mean democratic means as members of that kind of institution, even though they are horrible members when it comes to human rights. That's why we need a bottom line that is different than that doesn't rely on actors like states, it relies on humans, right? But okay, so that is true. We show our cards that if you care about multilateralism and if you care about publicity, etc., you are kind of caring about democratic inclusion, right? But frankly, if somebody doesn't care about that, they still will need to distinguish between the ideal elements they want to care and the deviant elements. And then you say with deviation is really risky business, I agree. Now Kant. I'm not using Kant at all, and this is a problem. It happens all the time. Whenever we have presented this talk many times now, one should stay away. Okay, so what we are using from Kant is not the idea of a world state. Maybe it shows because we believe in multilateralism, people may think that we are going towards a constitutionalization of global state, but not really. It's irrelevant in which way we go for that. What we are picking from Kant is the idea of a rightful condition. And that is a functionally defined. That is to say, and it makes sense because that's what we have created, at the national level, right? You need institutions that solve these three problems. This is a functional argument. It's that is the function of those institutions in the sense that at least they have to solve it, and on top of it, they need to achieve whichever goals they also had it independently. That's all we are trying to use from Kant. For the reason that because he was stuck with the second best problem, thinking about it, he had to distinguish the kind of the end state, the functions that you want to accomplish from the goals of the institutions themselves, and he left that open, and that is helpful to us for constructing the paper. But it creates a lot of impressions that on the one hand you have democracy, on the other you have council. Probably this is all going towards a world republic or something. And I'm not saying it's not going. I mean, it could be, but we are trying to not in any way make it dependent on that our argument works. Hopefully.
Can I underscore two things about what we said? So, what we said was that a second best strategy will include some ideal elements and some deviant elements. And then we illustrated it with some. So absolutely, because it will include some ideal elements, there's ideal in there. But the more interesting part of the argument is that it must also include some deviant elements. And then when you say why include those deviant elements, and you include those deviant elements because they protect your second best criteria that you're valuing. So if the rightful condition is only sometimes best achieved at the domestic level, then you don't want any reform that's going to undermine the rightful condition that's only at the domestic level. And so that's why you're prioritizing it. So you pick whatever deviant elements will defend whatever you defined as your second best criterion that is the bottom line for you. That's the structure of the argument.
We have a question here.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, my question is a bit about clarification on the contestation criteria. You say that it's a matter. When there's contestation, you provide for inclusion. And I was wondering, what is the threshold for satisfying that criteria? Because if we allow for more informal sites of contestations, then it's really easy to satisfy this criteria. But since in the trade conversation, especially now, there's a lot of talk about what stakeholders are included are allowed to contest certain agreements. I was wondering, what is your threshold, if there is a threshold?
We're saying any reform that improves contestation would be allowable under us. So there's not a ceiling or a threshold. We're saying contestation is good, and so things that improve contestation, now of course there is the risk that it gets out of control and you undermine all support, but
it's limited by the two elements we mentioned. Like, if the contestation, not everything bears on the fundamental human rights of the most vulnerable. But if it happens to bear on that, that is where you get the no. Okay. No matter how nice in general contestation, if the contestation is going to kind of put at risk like the livelihoods of 1 million people, like no, that contestation is not allowed. But there are other things that may be because our ideal elements have to do with democratic inclusion. Then maybe if that contestation is helping democratic inclusion, but is not putting at risk the life of fundamental, rights of people, then we also think it's good, even though it may be sand in the way. It make the institution not to be able to get the goals done so quickly.
So another thing I should have underscored in response to Mikhail's argument is most of our argument is about the institution and procedure. But you can't have an argument that's just about the reform of the institution that doesn't have any substance. And so our substance comes in non-retrogression. And so that is a mismatch in the argument, is that when we're talking about reforming global governance institutions, that's about institutions. But you can't have that without any substance there, because something were to get undermined. And the only substance we put in is this non-retrogression. And they're two different things, they're apples and oranges.
So I have Hannah on the list.
Yes, thank you very much. I think probably my comments, questions will be along the line of some of what we've already heard. Because I've been thinking all along, I think that we've been experiencing over the last 5 years or so a considerable growth in autocratic societies in the world. And these societies are amongst the biggest states. I think there are around 11 states with populations of more than 100 million people in the world today. And the autocratic developments we've seen are in China, in Russia, in the Philippines, in Brazil, in Turkey, in Egypt, and probably others. These are all amongst the biggest countries in the world. So I think my question or my reflection is how does a second best option relate, or ideas about a second best option relate to these actual developments in the world today?
That's an excellent question.
I mean, because we're talking about global governance institutions, our focus is on just the institutions themselves. So what you're saying is that the institutions, the functioning of the institutions will be fundamentally changed by the changing nature of these other states. And I would just, yeah. This is not going to be a very satisfactory answer, but I noticed this problem when I was talking about the proliferation of PTAs, which is that nothing in the formal institutional rules of the WTO have changed with respect to PTAs, but the reality has changed, right? And in historical institutionalism, we call that institutional change through drift. And a good example of that is like if you say the minimum wage is going to be 10 euros an hour, and you keep it 10 euros an hour for 50 years. At the end of 50 years, 10 euros an hour is completely different than what it was, when it started. And any theory of reform of a global governance institution, it's never catching up to drift. And so I would just say that that's a problem that's outside of our framework and our model. But to be aware of, when you say, who are you arguing against? That's a question I always ask. We're arguing against the ideal theorist people, and they can't deal with that problem either because they're always proposing another, ideal. And so what we're saying is don't use that ideal theorist as the best way to have a map. But that's not to say that it solves every problem. It doesn't.
I mean, so long as the actors that belong to the institutions are bad actors, there's nothing that any kind of proposal can do of that kind.
Except for a non-retrogression, at least as a floor.
Right. We can judge that they are doing badly, right? In that way, but we cannot really actually make a proposal how to improve that. Like
but you couldn't change the WTO in a way that made it even easier to pass more and more retrogression. So that's our backstop, is the non-retrogression.
But I mean, if China doesn't it doesn't matter whether the International Court or any other kind of human rights institution tells China that it's violating rights. I mean, so what? That's the answer, right? So, there's nothing you can do. You can judge it based on our criteria, but you cannot necessarily force the hand of China. Like, I have no answer to how to force the hand of China. That is the real problem. I agree.
All right, so it perhaps may be a good time for me to ask my question, and that's perhaps slightly unrelated to the very argument you are making, but related to the title of the lecture series. And my question is, so when you are thinking about these possible reforms of the WTO, is there any room for rethinking global capitalism? Because that's the center you are co-directing. Yeah. And in a way, your proposals are quite conservative in that you simply assume that global regime of trade is good, its institutional structure can be improved, but you just take certain things for granted. That's also the question about your normative grounds and what is the first or the second best. So is there any room in your framework to rethink these very foundations, or is it just that you simply admit that you take certain things for granted and the second best is just to improve it?
I think we make an even stronger argument than that, but it's not that. It doesn't give the answer you're going to want to your question. The constructive vote of no confidence doesn't allow an elimination without a substitution that is better. Better in terms of promoting the second best goals and protecting the rights of the most vulnerable. And what we're saying is that to get rid of the WTO would open up a world to bilateralism and mercantilism. And because that alternative seems worse than reforming the system, that's when she says we're non-revolutionary like that. You could replace it with a totally different system. I just threw it up on a slide at the end and I didn't say exactly what that was. But let's say you wanted to say we've been doing these piecemeal reforms and now we're completely out of whack because a country that joined the WTO in 1994 has all these obligations that India, that joined at the beginning, does not. And why would you create a system where India has a much better deal compared to Bangladesh or compared to, you know, even more poor countries in Africa that were not part of the system? There's all kinds of things that are whacked out about the system. And so you could create quite a radically different system. You could say, we're going to redefine the initial balance of concessions and replace what we have now in India. Your grandfathered in bargain is going to go away. Or you could say, right now the countries can decide if they're a least developed country, and if you're a least developed country, you are it for everything. Maybe we want to say, well, India, you're not a least developed country when it comes to these products, but you are when it comes to these. And we want to break this category down and start to think about it differently. But to me, when I imagine a world where there is no multilateral trading system, it is a world of bilateralism that will lead to power even more, shaping the outcomes. And so, yeah, it is a conservative system like that of saying, let's not go backwards without a plan of where you're going to then replace it.
I mean, in my view, I come from a different place, but I kind of agree with everything she said, that coming from my place, my main concern with global capitalism is that it's being imposed by structural means, by the kind of fragmentation that we have, for example, by putting a lot of political power on something like an institution that is about trade liberalization, and of course having zero power put on UN institutions that supposedly protect human rights, right, by checking on what actors are doing and what countries are doing. And then the attempt to think that the most kind of neoliberal kind of institution, together with the IMF and the World Bank, the ones we have for global governance, that they may take control of defining the scope of human rights, that they may be the ones that if they get stronger, that trade lawyers determine the scope and the priorities of rights. And for example, you can see it in those proposals by Petersman, for example. He thinks that the right to property is a fundamental human right, which is not in any international human rights convention, actually. But imagine that will be crucial, because that's one of the things that the WTO is protecting via TRIPS, right? So if you let that institution determine and define the scope of human rights, then you have lost any possibility not only of democratically for countries to be able to define their own rights, but also in general even to have something like a principle of non-retrogression be operative. So my argument is really looks like conservative, and it's like kind of like not telling you where to go and whether socialism is the goal, but it's trying to avoid, because I do see how things can get much worse. If we buy into the idea that for any institution that solves any problem, let's make it as strong as possible in terms of assurance and whatever. I'm like, no, because that fixes the priorities. That already tells us that we have to first protect intellectual rights, and then we'll figure out whether we solve the problem of global burden of disease. But there is no institution that is solving that problem. So if we have the ability to define which political priorities globally we should be pursuing democratically, and then we try to do something, I will be in favor, because we are never going to be in that world, at least at this moment. It is important not to consolidate power in the wrong way. So that's kind of the spirit of my point of view with regard to capitalism. So it's not that I'm committed to trade liberalization. What I'm trying to do is to make sure that there is an independent way in which we don't define our rights such that they are limited by whatever system of trade liberalization is already in place, and you just have to take it as a factor. That's kind of like where this paper is. I mean, I have written more ambitious papers with regard to where we are going, but when it comes to the economy, I'm very worried about what we already have, the kind of impossibility for at the national level to really protect rights, because there is a supranational level that undermines that possibility, and it does structurally, not by having authority, just by in fact putting countries in a place where they can defend their rights even if they want to. A lot of actors are very bad, but Brazil was really exemplary in actually trying to provide what the Constitution requires, free medicines for HIV, for example, and couldn't, right? So that's...
But we're conceding at the first best idea, because we haven't even mentioned the environment, which is also gaping in the global capitalist system of no one paying attention to. But the whole conversation assumes that the first best ideal is, for whatever reasons, not available. And so it's about not imagining, you know, for all the people who want to go and imagine a first best ideal, great. I mean, we're not saying don't do that. She's a philosopher, she would never say that. You know, people have to, because how can you evaluate what you have if you don't have an ideal?
But why don't you ask, and I was just about to raise that, because Kant was certainly not thinking about just planet destruction, which we possibly are facing. Right. So why don't you think if mercantilism can be perhaps the thing which will save the planet in the end and the environment?
Why would you think that?
I mean,
if you decrease the amount of exchange of goods around the planet.
Oh, you mean by
by
sending our economy back all these years that you can't consume, and it just like we go backwards in time?
But that is a different conversation. What I'm against is bilateralism. Means where we were in the 19th century, the strong countries simply kind of like destroy the small countries. That's to me what bilateralism means. It means China negotiating with Ghana. That's what I mean. Why is that bad? I think doesn't need answer. It's like Ghana has zero power and China has all the power. It's like, don't do that in general. No matter what, it's not going to turn out okay. That's what I meant. Not that I don't like other system of capitalism in the sense of mercantile. Like, I don't know, yes, maybe even tariffs. I have no view over that. Like protecting at the national level and having an economy that is not global. This is not the paper, but in general, I haven't made up my mind at all. But going back to the powerful being able to screw the weak is like, no, don't ever do that, no matter which system you were hoping for, because you're consolidating power. But yeah, maybe, but not with regard to the fact whether we should have, I don't know, a system of tariffs that makes the economy no longer a global economy, but eventually a local.
Oh no, we didn't.
I don't know.
No, because you could replace it with a constructive vote. But I mean,
not giving the power to the powerful. More power won't get you the either. You see what I'm saying? Like that's a political question, not an economic. And to me, it's clear that's what we mean about multilateralism, giving some protection to the weakest partners in decision making. But maybe the object should be not to have a global economy, to go back to national economies. I don't know.
But you could even do that within the WTO, because you just would change the balance of concessions. You would just say whatever trade agreement, and maybe your trade agreement is everybody raises their tariffs another 50%. We've spent 100 years lowering our tariffs and it went too far. So let's make a new balance of concessions that allows everyone to start up here again. You know, you could totally do that within a constructive vote of no confidence in the WTO framework. It would just have to be multilaterally done. You would have to meet the criteria of publicity, which is at the end, we all came together and decided we don't like neoliberalism, which I'm fine with. Let's go back to a system that has a lot more protection. And we allow the countries that even need to opt out of that system even more and become autarkic if they want to protect the most vulnerable people. I see that as inside of the constructive vote of no confidence, because it's about most of the arguments are about procedure, not about the substantive outcome, as long as non-retrogression.
I don't want to my position anymore. I just thought that it might be a very important change, like the place where you start. And in your framework, the place you start is international good as such is good, and with some exceptions, like limitations based on human rights or other concerns. What if you turn that around and you just take saving the planet as the ultimate goal? I know it's the first ideal, perhaps non-achievable theory.
No, because of all the...
Then you would allow trade only as long as it doesn't damage the environment.
No, you could have that as your...
You have bilateralism. Can you imagine, like each country, depending on their threat advantage, deciding whether or not saving the planet? You know what I'm saying? Like, how do you get even to agree to a goal that constrains what we decide? You can't go like unilateral, because each country will have its own other agenda about whether it's worth saving the environment. You see what I'm saying? Like, but if it's ever going to happen, it will have to be in a kind of multilateral context.
You could substitute our non-retrogression criteria for an environmental criteria, or you could say you need two criteria. You need both an environmental criteria and a non-retrogression criteria, and then you would just be saying that I want to substitute your second best model. To me, it's too low.
So it's maybe just a call to add one more criterion to your list.
But I don't, for my work in human rights, I don't see, because I work on socioeconomic rights, I don't see how ever the deterioration of the environment cannot affect the fundamental rights of the most vulnerable wherever they are, right? Like, to me, it's built in. And environmental criteria is part of human rights, absolutely, especially if you're looking at exactly that. So if you have no access to food because you are in danger of being flooded constantly, right, that is a concern. The environmental concern directly affects the fundamental rights of the most vulnerable due to environmental degradation. You see what I'm saying? Like, to me, it's not something you could not have in human rights, right? Doesn't mean it's, as it is now, it's sufficiently there, but because of what it is about, what it's meant to protect, it cannot be out. And for example, like my model, it's a different paper, but I always look at the consequence of having the non-retrogression for human rights is that you need for any institution to have human rights impact assessments, right? That's how they will know whether or not what they are proposing to do will have that effect. And in fact, that has been really pushed as an agenda to have something like human rights impact assessments. Those human rights impact assessments are based on the model of environmental impact assessment. Actually, that's how it started. So they are building together, like there is no such thing as trying to figure out how the effect will be without also taking into account environmental effects, right? Which doesn't mean that it's having the goal of saving the planet as the overarching goal. That's different, but which I'm fine, right? But the idea is, like, I don't see how letting the powerful countries unconstrained negotiate what they do with others will ever get us there, because it's very hard.
But that's her set of arguments. We don't. I mean, so this is when you collaborate. The risk of whenever you change one piece and all the things that go. So, as a peace pact, we're not going to change that piece and add that in as a peace pact. But you know, if you were a radical environmentalist and thought we were being so speciesist, we are prioritizing human beings among all other animals, which we are. And you wanted to make your second best governance criteria to be a radical environmentalist that puts the earth over human beings, and earth's bugs, rodents, everything over human beings. Okay, then we can have that conversation. But the thing is that you just want the conversation about, tell me what your second best is. That's then the roadmap. And then we can fight about the second best. But for the purpose of this paper, we just offered one out there, one that connects to her long literature of reasons, and tried to illustrate how that gives you a different guide than an ideal theory.
Right, I'm sorry to continue, but I really do not want to misuse my position anymore. And Jakob was waiting still patiently to say something.
Yeah, interestingly, we were getting around here. But perhaps I'd like to go back to the whole idea of the second best. And you presented it as something you hadn't, you were somewhat surprised that you didn't see it anywhere in the literature.
On global governance.
On global governance.
Yeah. You list a lot of places where it's present in the literature, on global governance specifically. But in a sense, I'm just worried a bit that you're perhaps overstating the novelty of the fundamental perspective. In a sense, it's sort of a rather ancient debate. We have the cliche of don't let the best get in the way of the good, and Machiavelli clearly blaming naive utopianists everywhere that their lack of knowledge of how the world revolves basically affects our own ruin. I found a quote which is beautiful, I like, where he says, "Many have pictured republics and principalities which in fact have never been known or seen, because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live, that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner affects his ruin than his preservation. For a man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil." In a way, that's a very early, I'd say, rough and ready formulation of the idea of the second best. And in that sense, perhaps pushing a bit, there might be something about the principle of approximation, but perhaps an overstatement of the call for realism and pragmatism that is very much present in your paper. What exactly would not be achieved by simply subscribing to this in terms of are you not just empirically well informed about WTO Machiavellianists?
No, because that is a much bigger concern. That was your question. Like, you have to be a realist. You need to know what to answer to the question of what about when the bad actors are there. You need to take into account unintended consequences. All of that really is not the second best. The second best is a very much smaller question that I'm not saying, we are not saying nobody has ever sent before the literature we're referring to in the 20th century. No, Kant saw it. Like the problem is kind of known, not with the name, not with the way of thinking of it, but in that way. However, it's not every other version of realism, pragmatism, not. There are many other concerns. This is really like the contrast is really approximation only within ideal, non-ideal theory. But that doesn't solve the other problems that Machiavelli is also talking about, that we all need to worry, and that you see, like the moment we are asked, we don't have anything to say about, like, hold on, but what about, it's like the drift problem. Like, we can address it. Like, there are other realist problems that you need to take into account to avoid, to make the better the enemy of the whatever, of the good, right? So that is much bigger. There are many more considerations. The approximation versus second best is a much smaller, much close to the ideal only, to the things that your model already should be able to foresee. How do you think about it? And everything else that requires realism and pragmatism, like realizing how the world really is, the need for compromises. There are a lot of, the whole thing, that is not properly, it wouldn't help to call that and make them part of the second best, really. I think that's a different issue, many different issues. And we just don't handle those. And you have seen in the answers, we don't even try to say, I have something about what to do about realism. No, not really. But it is a lot of approximationist strategies in the literature you can read on proposals for global governance. And that is really the only aspect that the second best really handles, in my view, not every other aspect of realizing that reality is not ideal.
We banned eliminationists. What you're pointing out in Machiavellian is that utopian theory has been criticized from the beginning. And Machiavellian also said, so once you throw out utopian theories, then the ends justifies the means and anything goes. No, then you're left with no roadmap. We're saying come up with the second best criteria and use that, give up the ideal, come up with second best criteria, and absolutely define and defend that. And so we're arguing against idealists, but we're also arguing against what I would wrongly call critical theory approaches that would say there's this problem. This problem, the WTO is not democratic, get rid of it. The EU doesn't have enough democratic input, get rid of it. I call these eliminationist strategies. The problem with when you put your finger on one problem, either your answer is to imagine if you fix that one problem, everything's fine, or to eliminate the institution because it has that one problem. Either of those are bad and not allowed. Instead, we're saying no, come up with whatever second best you're going to defend, and then use that as the guide and defend it. And we barred elimination strategies. We only allow the constructive vote of no confidence. So that's how I see it as different.
Right, so I think we reached the end of the debate for now, certainly.
We're sure we haven't settled the question.
Right, well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. And thank you for